We got some news this week that got lost in the flurry of other news, but it is significant, or at least it ought to be. The federal budget deficit for this fiscal year is approaching $1 trillion, and that's with a T. And you can thank in large part the Trump tax cuts and the government record spending to make the number up. This is especially troubling because this comes at a time of economic expansion and record low unemployment. Now, I want to read in part what Paul Krugman had to say in a recent piece. He, a Nobel laureate in economics, he writes for the Times. The budget deficit has now soared back roughly to where it was in 2012 when the unemployment rate was more than twice its current level and the economy desperately needed deficit spending to sustain demand. Well, let's bring in our guest right now, Jared Bernstein. He was vice president for Joe Biden's chief economist, and now he's senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Jared, thank you for a few. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
When this headline happened, two things were notable. A, it got lost with all the other craziness going on, but the absence of any wringing of the hands or consternation from some of the same folks. And I went back about 8-9 years ago to Republicans on the Hill when we were in the middle of a recession, talking about with all the apocalyptic consequences of the deficits then. And now it seems to me, at least, where we have a choice and we're choosing to both, increase spending and also cut taxes, especially for the well-to-do, not a peep. It's jarring when you look at then and now.
Exactly right. And in fact, I was in the Obama administration back then, and we were definitely engaged in deficit spending, temporary spending to offset the very sharp contraction in the economy, otherwise known as the Great Recession. And the deficit got up to 10% of GDP in those years, but it came down to between 2 and 3% before we left office. So that is the much more traditional type of approach to this. What we're into now, I think of it as upside down Keynesianism. That is, we're stimulating an economy that's already closing in on full employment. And in fact, you mentioned the low unemployment rate. Historically, when the unemployment rate has been around as low as it is right now, 3.5%, the deficit as a share of GDP has been about zero. Instead, it's about 4.5% right now.
There's two common tracks. You know this far better than me. Traditionally, Republicans will say, well, we're going to want tax cuts and we're going to offset the loss of revenue, but we're going to cut spending programs. Democrats, historically, we want to have these programs. They're going to raise taxes to finance it. We have this bizarre world where, and he prides himself as an economic genius for it, where I'm going to cut taxes. Obviously, we're going to have less revenue. And by the way, I'm going to increase spending. And we're not at a time of war, et cetera, at least on a large scale. And somehow, some way, he wants a Nobel for that. And at the same time, nobody's calling him out for it. And to me, the worry is this going to be the next playbook going forward? Because there was no condemnation for what we've done and to future generations, why wouldn't everybody do it? This is the easiest way out. Spend what you want and give people tax cuts and make the next guy have to worry how to pay for it. Won't this potentially be the new normal?
Yeah, I think it already is the new normal. I think your question is, will it last as the new normal? And I think the answer is it probably will, conditional on one point that I'll get to in a second. But first of all, I just want to unpack some of what you said. I don't want to lose it in the conversation. So yeah, one of the arguments that was made about the Trump tax cut was that they were going to generate enough growth to pay for themselves. Now that cost is about $2 trillion over 10 years, so that's non-trivial money. And everybody knew at the time, except for people who were paid to believe otherwise, that of course that wasn't the case. Tax cuts never pay for themselves. So the extent of the hypocrisy, both on the tax cutting and increased spending side, can't be exaggerated. But here's the caveat. This behavior will continue, and it will probably ramp up. Because Democrats, who have been a lot more fiscally responsible, as I said, in the Obama administration, we pivoted to deficit reduction, arguably too soon, by the way, given economic conditions. But the deficit came down sharply on our watch. And of course, under Bill Clinton's watch, we had a budget surplus, the last one we've seen in decades. as long as interest rates stay low. And that's a huge caveat, a huge part of this conversation that often gets overlooked. The historical argument is that if the government runs budget deficits, it's going to crowd out private borrowing. That is, private investors will have to pay more in order to borrow in terms of higher interest rates because the government is sucking up all the loanable funds that are out there. Well, that's clearly not the case. So there actually is some important economics behind this that we've had to rethink. Interest rates are extremely low. The Federal Reserve's in the picture, so that's part of the story. There's very robust capital flows across the globe, so that's part of the story too. But if interest rates were start to go up sharply, especially given the burden that means in terms of financing our debt, then some of this thinking would change.
I want to play a soundbite for you from your old boss. He was on 60 Minutes this past weekend, and the question became about taxes. Here's what Joe Biden had to say.
You've said you would repeal all of Trump's tax cuts. But do you mean just for the wealthy or for the middle class too? Because Trump did give the middle class a tax cut.
Well, Trump gave a middle class tax cut that was negligible. The fact is that what we should be doing is making sure that the wealthy pay their fair share.
Are you worried, Jared, that this is going to be cast, and his is more modest than, let's say, what either Warren or Sanders' plan is, as wealth redistribution, that this is going to be socialism versus capitalism, that that's how this is going to be framed come next November here between the Republican, whether it's the president, and whoever the Democrat emerges to be?
No question that's how conservatives, or those for whom the tax cut was made, what I called the donor class earlier, will make exactly that argument. They already are. But the counter-argument is just screaming at anyone who wants to engage in this, and that's that we're already engaged in, earlier I was talking about upside-down capitalism. This is upside-down socialism. Socialism for the rich, capitalism for everybody else. That is, make sure the government redistributes upward through cutting taxes on corporations, cutting taxes on estates, allowing multinationals to run free and avoid taxation all across the globe, while you cut back on low-income programs that serve people of very modest means, or as the vice president correctly said, you cut back on the negligible tax cuts for the middle class. So they can make that argument, class warfare, all day, but they know whose class is winning. And when you talk to whether it's Biden or Warren or Sanders, I think one of the themes of the campaigns is, enough already with that upside-down socialism nonsense.
Jared, great job as always. I appreciate the time. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. When we come back, we're going to shift gears. A year after the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, we're seeing an alarming rise in anti-Semitism and other hate crimes. A man who worshipped the Tree of Life joins us after the break to discuss.